Hey guys, welcome to this video. Thanks for tuning in and sharing in this now moment with myself and with one another. If you haven't seen these videos before, welcome and welcome back if you have. I just want to pop right on and just go right into another energy update. I will be doing some more light language videos this weekend, and I've got a lot more quantum and esoteric realms I'd like to dive into, including some of the channel writings that I've been connecting with from my inner guidance team, my higher guidance team. I just want to get really kind of linear for a minute and then expand out from there about the energies. And, you know, I talked a lot about them in my last two videos, what they felt like and what we could be experiencing. But the themes that I want to talk about today are that have been coming up for me to discuss with you guys, and that's been coming up in session as well, is preparedness, redemption, redirection, what else? A bunch of R's. Well, I'll think of it in just a moment. Redemption. So I've been getting asked, should I be preparing for something? Is something bigger coming? Is something bigger on the way? Because it certainly feels that way to a lot of us. And I will share the best answer that I felt that I got from my higher guidance team in kind of a funny way, because really it's like we have to keep our sense of humor about this. We have to stay in our inner child, and it can be very challenging when we're having such a massive shakeup going on in all realms. So I'll back up and say the answer to that my guides gave me was, would it make you feel better to prepare for something bigger coming? So that was a loaded, it's a very broad question. And without going into, well, what's coming on all this, I'll get to that in just a moment. Well, I really am not going to give details. I'm going to tell you what I've seen that energetically is happening towards the end, what I saw in vision. But essentially, to answer the question is, would it make us feel better to prepare as if something massive might be coming that may require us to go within or to be without something that we're used to having on a regular basis? Now, without going into all those details, the basic answer to that is, if the reason it was answered, would it make you feel better, is because whatever we need to do right now to make us feel more secure, to make us feel more balanced and stable, is what we need to do right now. So that's the answer. And the reason I'm sharing this is because I keep getting shown time and time again that we are making choices, we are making decisions throughout our day, whether we're doing it consciously or unconsciously, it's still happening. And so what happens is we are oftentimes, we have things that happen that trigger us into a certain response or reaction. And that then heightens our cortisol and takes us out of centered alignment, takes us out of balance, and puts us into fear. That puts us into a place of reaction. And I love using the word reaction because it's doing something over and over again. It's a looping pattern. It's a habitual pattern that trains our body and our brain to be in this heightened state more than we might realize. Then what happens is it directly affects the choices and decisions that we are making throughout the day, which then keeps us in this habitual pattern where we do these things out of a response to a trigger that's coming from our environment or perhaps an outside source. This then cuts us off from one perspective or brings us out of alignment with our true source, which is where we get our feeling of, I've got a gut feeling about this. You have a knowing about certain things. The more we're tuning into the stuff out there, again, we're not necessarily doing this consciously. It's a subconscious thing. We're constantly being bombarded by propaganda. And I'll get to that in just a moment. So what happens is this puts us in this state of being, and it brings us out of presence. It brings us out of the present moment and projects us into fear projection, well, what if this happens? What's going to happen? When is it going to happen? Am I going to be safe? Is my family going to be safe? Am I going to have, domino effect, the ripple, right? So it can work both ways. We can ripple out into a good way, or we can ripple out into a more imbalanced way. And I don't like to say bad, because it's part of our human experience. If we label it as bad, then we put ourselves into another ripple of self-judgment, blame, and so on and so forth. So essentially what we're being invited to do is that self-mastery, where we don't fall into that pattern. So if we are hearing about potentials, and I'll talk a little bit about potentials and probabilities. Yeah, maybe a little bit in this. But if we are hearing about a potential interruption, let's say in our internet, because of perhaps a grid malfunction, that can bring up a feeling of, well, why? What does that mean? What if I can't talk to my family? What if I can't get on the internet? So on and so forth. For some people, not a big deal at all. For they might be more triggered by the idea that there could be big cold weather and their power could go out. I mean, that would affect everything, right? I'm using these little examples, or not so little examples, not to create fear or to trigger fear, but to ask, when we think about these things, what feelings does that stimulate in our body? Are we comfortable with those things and recognizing that that's just part of the reality that we're in right now, that there is a possibility at any given moment that something could disrupt our normal everyday activities? And if we're okay with that, then there is no fear or attachment to a particular outcome. And so what happens then is we're able to stay present and we're able to stay centered, so that if these things do occur, we can then handle them with as much grace as possible. And we don't then project our fear or project our worries and assumptions on our family, friends, coworkers, so on and so forth. We become a stabilizer rather than a destabilizer. Because if we are projecting that onto other people from a place of fear, we're creating an instability in a ripple energetic effect in the field. And many of us, we want to stabilize the field so that we can move through this process in a smoother and more expansive way. If we're in fear and we're destabilized, we cannot be as expansive as we want to be, because we are not open to the other possibilities. We are only stuck in one possibility, which is fear or survival mode, right? When we are in survival mode, and there's different layers of that as well. That's not what I want to get into, but most of the time we associate survival mode with being afraid, many times. But obviously there's people that have been trained in survival mode, how to detach themselves from fear, like people that are in the military, and just come into survival mode, which means being present, being aware, and doing whatever needs to be done to survive the situation. So there's different layers here. And so we're being invited to ask ourselves, how do I feel about this? And so the answer comes back to, if it makes us feel better to maybe have a little extra water, because then we're less likely to worry about being able to have water for our family, then go buy some extra water. But are we doing it out of fear? And if we are doing it out of fear and we're going out and cleaning off the toilet paper off the shelves because there's a lot of what ifs and there's a possibility that I might not have toilet paper next week. I'm not saying that that's the case, but we saw this happen. So all I'm doing is sharing, this is what happened, right? People freaked out, and then it didn't create balance. It created imbalance, which had a ripple effect for months to come. And it negatively affected other people who couldn't access some of the things they wanted because of the people that were in survival mode and fear. So again, what are we projecting? What is it that we want to where are we acting from, right? Are we reacting? Are we reenacting old plays, stages, and timelines? Or are we stepping into our power and going, you know what? I only have enough food for this week. And if next week there's a storm coming, it might be a good idea for me to prepare in case I don't have power for a couple of days. We do that all the time in California for earthquakes. I always had extra stuff in my car. I always had a jug of water and a blanket and just little things, mostly because if I wanted to go to the beach after work, I could just have it all ready to go. But there was that element of, what am I going to need? If I'm going to need it. So just be aware of that, because the more comfortable we can feel about what we have the ability to control as a human, the easier it will be for us to go, okay, I can relax a little bit. There's this heightened sense of instability because there is a constant projection of fear being interwoven through propaganda, and that's a play on words, and through all kinds of different portals, we'll call it. And so what happens is there's certain words that are being used over and over again. And I'm going to say, even if we don't listen to the news, we might have a group of friends that we hang out with, or a group of coworkers who do. And they are then perhaps parroting or repeating the words that are being used, that are being repeated and parroted to them. It's just part of what we do. How often do we use the word 100%? I never used 100% until everybody else started using 100%. Now I find myself saying 100%. And I find myself asking, is it really 100% or is it 90%? 50%. But that became a thing. Therefore, I mean, that's how it's always been. We do that. We mirror each other. And some of the new words, like, oh, I like using that. That's a fun description to use. You know, when I was in high school, it was cool, right? Cool. That's the word, cool. You know, in the 60s, maybe it was groovy, man. That's what everybody said. So recognizing some of those trigger words is really valuable right now. And I'm going to tell you one right now. It's climate change. All I hear, and it's like nails on a chalkboard. And it's not just that it's nails on a chalkboard, meaning it's annoying. It stands out to me because I'm like, you hear it, you start to hear these triggers, especially when we're centered and we are aware, watching with eyes to see, feeling with our extrasensory or normal abilities, listening to the sound behind the sound, the tone in someone's voice. We hear that it is a scripted sentence. We hear that their response is a scripted response. Why? Because it was the same response that 5 other people have had, on and on and on. I won't go into all those details, but I think I was watching a show and it was talking about weather, but they used the word climate change maybe in a matter of 3 minutes. I would say it was like a minute, maybe 2 minutes. I think they used it like 10 times. And finally I said, either their vocabulary isn't very vast, or that's something that is, and so several things happen. That then maps into our brain and we start to connect with climate change. And then we start to see things as a result of climate change, because then it mirrors back to us that what we're seeing, what we're tuning into. So there is synchronicities, and then there's also what we could call false synchronicities, right? Well, they're real, but we're hearing these words and then we start to tune into it in all of these other places, and it becomes part of our system where we think climate change. Why am I thinking about climate change? Advertisers do it, trigger words, playful words, different songs What do you think an advertisement, give me a break, break me off a piece of that Kit Kat bar. And then we're like, gosh, I could really go for a Kit Kat bar. Give me a break. It's just a mapping system, and it creates a pin drop in that particular word that then activates a certain recognition to that word. So we tune into it and we begin to believe in it, whether we realize it consciously or not. So then we have a tendency to repeat that system. Oh, it's just because of climate change. Oh, it's in your genes, right? Oh, everybody has it. It's just, and I just as guilty. I've done it before. I still catch myself doing it 100%. I'm not going to stop using that term. I like it, but I also recognize that that's kind of a trendy comment. So there's a lot of those. And so what happens is we just don't recognize it necessarily. And then we start to have proof as to why these words, for example, are real. And I want to just say as a disclaimer here, I am not saying in this statement that climate change is not real, nor am I saying that it is real. I will share from a multidimensional perspective from what I've seen on other planets, from my remote viewing and from my own inner guidance team and higher guidance team and science. Well, let's get rid of the esoteric for a moment and just say science, that all of the planets are getting warmer, that there are cycles and massive things that have happened previously that we tend to forget about. There were storms back in the 1920s and the 1930s that wiped out entire towns. Yes, based on the structures and based on the lack of preparedness. However, those were massive storms. And so there's a lot of information that isn't being provided. And we have to read between the lines to ask ourselves, okay, if climate change, for example, I'm just using this, there are so many trigger words we can use that I just won't even say. How many times have you heard the word having to do associated? What words have you heard associated with COrVID that come up over and over and over again? And you start to think, is that the only word they know? But it becomes part of our then vocabulary. And we start to build our structure so I'm getting back to triggers around that. So now I hear the word, it's like Pavlov's dogs. I hear it and it triggers something in me as if, okay, it's just normal. That's a normal thing. And then it becomes like, well, I've heard it so much, it must be real. So these are just things to think about, because this is happening all of the time, all around us. It's happening in social media. It's happening through the television. It's happening in conversations with friends. I will have a conversation with someone and they say these words that I understand they know nothing about, yet they're repeating what their friend told them. And they haven't actually necessarily gone a little deeper to see if that is an actual truth, or if they're just repeating what they've heard that they think might be true. So these are all just things to take into consideration while we go through these processes. So preparedness, okay, so let me go back to that. As we recognize these words, we are being invited to acknowledge, how do we feel in our body? What is this triggering for us? For if I'm hearing this and they say, well, due to climate change, this winter is going to be there are possibilities, and I'm going to talk with, again, versus probability, possibilities that we could be experiencing massive blackouts. Okay, we hear those words and those might make us feel fearful. And then we go out and clean out the shelves because we're in fear. And then maybe nothing even happens. And we went through all this heightened cortisol, when in reality, we could have just said, all right, maybe it's a possibility that this could happen. I'm going to purchase items that I'm going to use anyways. And then I can just relax in the knowing that I am prepared for, a few days, a few weeks, whatever makes you feel comfortable. I understand some people are stocking up for a lot more than that. I am not one of them. But again, are we doing it out of fear, or are we doing it out of being logical, analytical, and allowing ourselves to just relax? So recognize when we get caught up in that. The possibilities and the probabilities. A possibility, it's always a possibility from one perspective that during hurricane season, we might get a hurricane. Is it a probability that we're going to get a hurricane? Not necessarily. Those are the things to keep in mind as well. There's a lot of this timeline stuff where I hear this a lot, it's inevitable. That's another trigger word for me. Is it really? Is it 100%? It's inevitable that this is going to be what we're required to do at some point. Or are we creating that by believing that it is 100% inevitable? Because from my perspective, as multidimensional beings who are constantly shifting, changing, and flexing our realities as creator beings, there is no inevitability in man-made rules, unless we choose as a collective to bring that into our reality and to create and manifest it. Then it becomes an inevitability. Is there a high probability? If we all believe there is, then the probability becomes much higher of that coming into manifestation. Is it possible? Sure. So I'm just playing with this because these are how I view things when I'm in flow. And this is the way my guides talk with me about this kind of stuff. It's a conversation. So I've done things to make myself feel a bit more relaxed and able to stabilize my field without falling victim or prey. I'm hearing more well-spoken would be prey to these particular programs, right, that we are being blasted with throughout our day. So of course we have the next layer, which is, well, what is going to happen? Is there going to be a fill in the blanks, political upleveling, social uprising, natural disaster, situation with the COrVID, so on and so forth? And I would say that some things have higher probabilities because we've focused so much on them, and some things are inevitable in order to bring things up and to be noticed, right? There's those bugs again. However, that doesn't mean that it's going to happen. So I see different possibilities and I see different probabilities when I look into the field and I'm looking at different timelines. Now, I understand that we might just be on one timeline, but within that timeline, we each have our own individual timelines. And there are certain things that I see parts of that timeline. And that I won't get into all of that because that's something I still have difficulty explaining and wrapping my brain around. But essentially, there's a lot that can happen on this one particular timeline. There's events that can unfold that have possibilities and probabilities. But again, coming back to the question becomes, what are we going to do about it? If we are all focused on one possibility, it then becomes a higher probability, which then becomes a possible inevitability. So how these things look, though, can be very different from how we think they might look. And that's something else to keep in mind, because that can change also throughout our journey, throughout our cycles, as we choose and make different decisions. If we are making a choice or a decision from our centeredness and we're not reacting because we have been, I'm hearing, propaganded with fear, we then are able to make these choices about our possibilities and probabilities from a more balanced and less altered state. Therefore, we make choices that are based on a centered awareness and knowingness that then keep us on a higher probability for a higher outcome that has less maybe tumultuous cycles in it from one perspective. So this is what I'm seeing is why it is so important for us to just stay as balanced and centered as we can. And so recognizing when we're out of tune, out of whack, and when we're tuning into things that are stimulating and triggering certain fears for us. Although I will share that that can be a very powerful gift, because if we recognize and we become conscious and aware of what is triggering us, we can then not be triggered by it. Or if it's not working, we turn it off. We tune into something different that allows us to stabilize our field until we can come back into that coherence. Coherent heart brain wave activity that then doesn't pull us out of alignment and into a timeline that we do not necessarily prefer. That doesn't mean that that out of alignment doesn't hold many different realizations and lessons for us along the way, or better spoken, opportunities to make other choices based on the perspective that we're holding from the place of anger, fear, survival. So the survival mode is very important. Feeling comfortable that we have what we need to survive can help us to take a step back and go, what am I worried about? And then that leads me to the next question. Well, what, where, who, why? Again, my guidance team always says, well, first of all, they tell me, you know, and I do. I have this deep innate sense about many things of what's going to be revealed, how it's going to be revealed, and how, but not necessarily how it's going to look when it's revealed. So that's something I wanted to make you guys aware of. Many of you know, many of you have done the research, many of you, and I'm being guided to take a step back and recognize that this propaganda or triggers of fear is coming from both directions. Just because someone is sharing the truth, if they're sharing the truth, but they're doing it in a place of fear, they are then projecting that fear through the hologram that ripples out into the field. So they might be saying, this is happening, you know, get stable, stabilize your frequencies, this is coming. That is the same vibration. That's a frequency match of fear to the same fear of we will rule. I don't know, whatever dark things are. Drink Mountain Dew every day and eat potato chips and eat red food coloring. I mean, that's obviously really mild negative, but I'm just trying to give that an example. That's matching fear, 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 or the fear of, so it can go both ways. Those were not good examples, but hopefully you guys get what I mean. So it is actually being pushed through the light and pushed through the dark. It's an energy. It doesn't mean it's good or bad. It's just fear. So somebody can be a really good person sharing messages of fear, and it still is what it is. It's fear. So it doesn't matter if it's wrapped in a pretty package or it holds truth behind it. It can trigger within us that sensation. And that's where we have to use our discernment to then separate ourselves from that energy and not feed back into that looping system. And CERN has been coming up a lot as well. We can use this discernment to disconnect from this lower frequency hum that's in the background that is scattering our frequency. Heart, brain coherence pulls us back into centered alignment and separates us from all of that noise. And we're then able to see clearly and make the proper choices in order to survive with the most grace, with the most joy, with the most, yeah. So, okay. What else? I was guided, let's not worry about the details. I understand that some of the things that are about to come up, I was shown, so I'll talk about the energetic. I was shown a big black goo of, it looks like squid ink, a big bowl of squid ink, for example. And picture that underneath us, for lack of better linear terms. And then what's happened is a wave of sound has hit us. And now it's gone. So like, you know, in the Matrix, when, or in movies where they'll do like a slow motion, I don't know what it's called, but all of a sudden you'll see the raindrops and the person moving. That's what it looked like to me. And so this sound has hit us to balance out the lower sounds that have been in the background. And now our frequency goes, whoop. Now pause, hit the pause button for a moment and picture yourself as Neo in the Matrix, frozen in time, able to see everything around you. And then underneath is this black goo that represents many different things. It could be literal. It can also represent energy that's been hidden and held within a distorted field. So now that is all coming up in droplets as well. It's coming up from the cracks. It's coming up from portals. And whatever vibrates at that frequency, you name it, there it is right with us. So as above, so below, as within, so without. So this sound opens our hearts and helps us to find a higher vibration, but it also rips the other stuff out of hiding, because they cannot exist within that particular frequency the way in which they were before. So it doesn't mean they can't exist, although I have been shown some things that just dissolved or moved on and moved out because they just can't handle it. And I say they with love, whatever that might be. Parasites, entities, beliefs, programs, stories, whatever. So that energy then helps to dissolve, integrate, and process all of this blackness that's coming up. And I'm hearing still waters run deep. So it's like this goes into many different layers. And essentially, we as the starseed community are the shock absorbers. So that's the key word. We are the shock absorbers. And so there are those that are revert, like it's like, whoa, 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 what do I do? Where do I go? Oh no, fear, 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 because they haven't mastered self-mastery. Not that any of us necessarily have. We all have moments as a human that reacts to what we're seeing. But those of us that have processed a lot of what we know is going on behind the scenes. And you guys, I just want to take a step back, and I keep being guided to share. A lot of us think we know what's going on behind the scenes, and it isn't true. I just have to put that out there. And whatever that might be, I'm not providing the details, because what happens is we are being invited to use our own discernment. I am not here to tell you this is happening behind the scenes. I will say some little things, but not all of it is necessarily true. So again, let go of the idea that it needs to look a certain way or it needs to come out a certain way, because black goo is black goo, no matter how you slice it. It just is a vibrational frequency. So recognizing that and not being attached to a certain person being who we think they are, or a certain truth story being exactly what it is. A lot of the stuff we're hearing about is true, but more importantly, it has elements of truth. So I just really wanted to clarify that. So a lot of the stuff that we're hearing about isn't 100%. It's still got black goo interlaced in between the truth. So that's where we aren't stable enough or centered enough or aware enough to discern which is which and to separate the gook from the reality or from the real truth, then it's easy to be misled, and it's easy to put our hopes into someone or something that also has some attachments to these frequencies, if that makes sense. And I, by the way, I'm not talking about any one person, place, or thing in particular. I'm not. I'm just giving an overall generalization of stories that we might be wholeheartedly, attached to. Because let's say some of those are true and some of them aren't. What my team always says is go deeper. Okay, this person is helping here and this is going on behind the scenes. Okay, go deeper. Okay, go deeper. Why? Why is this happening? How does this make you feel? What can you do about it? Okay, nothing? Great. You have to go back to you and help your family and be kind to your friends and let go of the need to hang on to these attachments. And the reason I'm sharing this is because some of these stories that we are so attached to the outcome of, and I was attached to some of them in the beginning as well, they're not real anymore. They might have been real at one time, but we've mapped into a different reality. Therefore, some of these stories are no longer relevant or real. And I know that sounds crazy, but that is a multidimensional way to look at how our reality shifts and timelines shift. So if it happened on another timeline, it may not actually exist in this timeline. And we're trying to hang on to something that is no longer existent on this timeline. Therefore, it is no longer real in this particular version of our reality. I know, crazy to think about. It's like, what? Okay. So I hope that kind of made sense. And so if we're hanging on, we're like split between these timelines. It's okay just to let that go and be like, all right, I'm going to show up and this just looks totally different for me now. And it allows us to reset ourselves. It allows us to reinvent ourselves, really. And we're not obligated to hang on to these old constructs that may have been really important. We might feel that they were really important at one time, and maybe in that timeline they were. But now we've gone into something so different that it's no longer relevant. It's not as important as we think it is. It's not as important as the energy that we're giving it. And it's not important enough for us to put our focus, our creative focus, that then brings that possibility into an inevitability, right? Is that necessary for us to really move into a broader and more expansive view? And most of the time it's not, because we've attached an outcome or a story, an expectation. And sometimes it's like we want a certain thing to happen in our lives. It doesn't happen. We're disappointed. And then all of a sudden, a year later, we meet the love of our lives, who we never met, right? If we hadn't have, let's say we're in a relationship and we think we're going to have children with this person and it's going to work out. And then that person cheats on us and we're just devastated. And we think our lives are over. And then boom, we meet somebody else and that's the love of our lives, who we thought that was the love of our lives before. But because we were not looking at things from a certain perspective, we hadn't learned the lessons about what it feels like to be lied to, about what it feels like to be cherished and adored, about what it really feels like to have a partnership where it doesn't feel like we're being lied to. Do you know what I mean? So now we look back and go, oh, wow, I really wanted that. And that person I really believed was perfect for me. And maybe at one time they were, but then something happened, choices were made, and they no longer fit that category because they no longer fit into the most appropriate timeline for either one of you. And now here we're in a completely different space. That's how it looks when I look at our reality. The matrix that we're in doesn't have the same operating system that the old one did. 3D does not operate the same as 5D or 4D or 7D or however we want to label it. So therefore, why do we keep putting the same expectations on a higher dimension and we want to pull through these lower expectations, right? It's more than what we could expect. And the layers are more than what we think they are. So, okay, I'm going to end on that note. You guys, in love and light, thank you so much for tuning in. If you have any questions, send them my way. I'm sorry if I haven't read the comments yet, but I'm going to read them this weekend. And I hope that somebody found this helpful or, I don't know, activating, I guess. In love and light. Namaste.